Okay, good morning. I'm just making sure that we've got everything, actually good afternoon, I guess. Making sure that everything is up and running here, but I think we're good. Mark, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, well, good afternoon, folks. Today we are talking about WFDSS and going to do a deep dive into the WFDSS data management tab. And so I'm glad everyone's here. We had over 100 people register, and so Mark Hale, the other person that you'll hear on the phone, and myself, Ben Butler, are glad to have you here. Mark and I work for the Wildland Fire Management RD&A, or Research Development and Application Program, based out of Boise, but Mark is over in the Midwest, over in Minnesota. So I'm here in Boise today, and it's the sun's shining, and it's a nice day. Uh, Today we are offering live captioning for this webinar, and so Diane shared a link for us in the chat window, and so you can find a slightly different link in the chat window. But if you use this link in a web browser, you will actually see live captioning. So whatever I say gets typed and it shows up there. So you can kind of do a split screen approach and see that. And then we'll also have that available after this webinar as well. And we think it's pretty cool. And thank the folks behind the scenes doing that. Today we are, due to the sheer size of the audience, we're going to have to keep everyone probably on mute. We're hoping there's some time at the end to maybe have folks come off mute and ask a question or two, but we do want to hear your questions, and we will pause at a few points throughout this presentation to catch a couple questions, and then we'll also potentially have time at the end to answer some live questions. So if you have questions, I realize that the little box where you type questions might look slightly different now that GoToWebinar has been updated, but in the panel that slides out by pressing the orange arrow, you should see a question box in there. And so if you have questions along the way, please feel free to go ahead and type it in there. You can also send Mark or myself an email, and you can find our email addresses on the RD&A webpage. So that's
And I'll be monitoring those questions that are on the webinar too. So if something comes up, I can prompt Ben.
Yeah, that'd be great. And so we may have a chance to answer them in real time, but we're going to try to catch them at a couple points. So a quick agenda for today. We'll start off with a pretty basic intro to the data management tab and what's in there and all that good stuff. And then we'll move to understanding the WFDSS planning processes, then preparing your data for use in WFDSS, on to using the WFDSS data management tab and really how to do it and button pushing and all that. And then we'll talk a fair amount about making the switch to spatial fire planning. A lot of folks looking to move to spatial fire planning, and so we want to cover that in pretty good depth. And then, Mark, if there's time, we'll make you a WFDSS guru.
There you go.
All right, so we're going to start off, and I wanted to just start off by launching a poll. And basically, it's asking how familiar are you with the data management tab. And so I'll go ahead and launch that, and then on your screen, if you could go ahead and tell us how familiar you feel you are, that'll give us an idea of more or less the folks that we have in the audience and how we can tailor our presentation. And we'll give it another 20 seconds or so. 85% voted. Everybody's in a attentive mood this afternoon. 91. I think that's probably about where we're going to get. So I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So it looks like about 22% very familiar. People call them for help, so they're already gurus. Um, and only 14% who are not at all familiar. So anymore, I think WFDSS has been around for enough years where folks are getting into even the less exciting parts of the data management tab. So that's great, and thanks for sharing that. I'm gonna just do one more, I think, while we're in the poll mode here, and this one's asking which planning process folks are looking to use. And Mark, I'm gonna guess 85% spatial fire planning.
Yeah, I'm betting you're right. So there's, so as people know, not everyone's required to go. The Forest Service is required, so it'll be a little higher number there probably.
Yeah.
Spatial.
Yeah. I don't know. 91. Okay, we're at that magic 92. 93%. We'll go ahead and close it and share. Oh, 77% looking to move to spatial fire planning, and still some folks trying to decide, which is great. I think it's that there may not be uh, a perfect answer in your mind, and so hopefully we can help folks get to that point by talking about what each of them have. Okay, let's go. We did that. We did that. So starting very general at the kind of 30,000 foot mark, when you first log into WFDSS, as you should know or likely do know, there's a series of tabs across the top that act as kind of your general navigation, and it ranges anywhere from My Home all the way over to the Data Management tab on the far right. And so today we're going to really only talk about the Data Management tab and the things that you can do from that tab. And so when you click on the Data Management tab, there's 5 different sub-tabs that appear below the main heading. And so those are the FMU/SO codes. And this tab is really what you use to kind of manage or create, delete, deactivate FMU or strategic objective shape codes. And so most folks aren't going to use that too much, but we'll talk briefly about it. The next tab is the Objectives tab, and this is really the meat and potatoes of the Data Management tab. This is where you create and manage your strategic objective statements and your management requirement statements. And so a lot going on there. And then the other tab is the Unit Shapes tab. And so this tab's starting to get more use now that more folks are moving to the spatial fire planning process. And this is where you can really work with some of your spatial data, I guess this should say. This is where you can create and version and delete and manage your management requirement shapes, and then also create and upload and manage your other unit shapes. So that's a useful tab. And then this is, we added this unit map. It's been a while now, a number of versions ago. But this is to me, it's a really neat tab because it allows you to really spatially depict all of this stuff and really take a look at it kind of before you go into decision mode, if you will. And you can also make some changes to your associations and associating text with polygons and etc. and so forth. And then we also added in a notes tab a while back, and that's just real useful for kind of capturing notes. I did this on such and such a date, and I'd like to try that next year, and this worked well, that didn't. So that's the general overview, and I thought we'd just keep kind of trucking through. Ultimately, Mark, we're working towards getting to a demonstration and actually getting into the application. So,
yep, that'll be good.
So, looking at preparing your data, I think this is one of the critical steps to really working with the data management tab in WFDSS. and it is basically the steps you do outside of WFDS, and it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing in a lot of ways, but you have to have a pretty good understanding of how the system works to create data for the system. So we're going to talk about the types of data that you should be or will be preparing to load into WFDS. And the first one in yellow is this is text-based data or tabular data, if you will. And these are the strategic objectives and management requirements. So these are statements that come directly out of your FMP or your LRMP or other management plans that you might have depending on agency and geography. But these are statements that are often tied to locations on the ground, but we're purely looking in this type of data for the text, not anything spatial, so no shape files. And then the other three types below are really those shape data. They're the shape files that you might load or submit to WFDS for loading. The first one is, arguably the bigger of the three, and that's your strategic objective shapes or your FMUs, depending on the planning process that you're using. And these are polygons that vary. I guess the way I describe it, is they outline your response to fire. So I'm always going to suppress the fire inside this polygon. Those are sort of your big strategy statements or the polygons that describe your strategic areas or zones or units. We used to have the problem, and we don't so much have it anymore, but we used to have the problem early on in WFDS that folks got FMUs confused with FPAs, FPUs, and I'm kind of glad we don't have that problem anymore. So these strategic objective shapes, or FMUs, are going to tie to your strategic objective statements and potentially your management requirements. The next category of shapes that we have the potential to use are the management requirement shapes. Management requirement shapes only come into play if you're using the spatial fire planning process. And we'll talk more about those processes later. So I think it's important at this point in the game really to kind of call these optional or contingent upon a planning process choice. But these are polygons that define areas with management requirements or considerations or constraints. So management requirement shape might be something like, no dozers in the prairie dog town. Something that represents a constraint to your strategy or a consideration to have while carrying out your strategy, or a firm requirement that says absolutely no one's allowed in here unless you're a tribal member. So that's really kind of in a nutshell management requirement shapes.
And Ben, the other thing I was going to say, break in here, is that could be requirements for desired conditions as well.
Yeah.
That you're trying to meet. So.
Yeah, we'll see when we talk about planning process and we really kind of get into the application. I think we'll see that this is a very robust category. It can be used for a lot of different things. And what I think is really cool, Mark, is that we're starting to see people really utilize it well and figure out really neat ways to utilize the options we have with management requirement shapes.
Yep.
But again, those kind of come with the spatial fire planning, and we'll chat more. Everybody gets a chance to use other unit shapes. For those that have been WFDS users for a long time and have been data management power users for a while, we used to just plainly call these unit shapes. And now we call them other unit shapes. The three different types of shapes that we see here are all under the category of unit shapes. So strategic objectives, or FMUs, are a type of unit shape. Management requirement shapes are a type of unit shape. And then we're not very original with names, Mark, so we just called them other unit shapes. And it works. But these are other spatial data that are useful to describe general features on the landscape or on your unit. It might be just sort of referential data. Here's our district boundary layer. Here's the watershed boundary. We don't have to do anything special when we cross it, but we just like it to be in there so that people can see it. Or it might be something very implicit that you want to point out, and you have the option with these unit shapes for the data to appear in a decision. You can't tie any text to it, but you have that option to check a box and say, I want you to let people know when they draw a polygon and it includes these data, that these data are there. So pretty referential, can't tie any text to it. You can't put any requirement statement or anything like that to it. But they are useful, and we'll talk about ways where they can be. So let's dive down one layer deeper and take a closer look at each of the three shape types, the three unit shape types. And the first one I wanted to look at is the strategic objective shapes, or the FMUs. And so, again, it depends on which planning process you use, which term applies, but they're both handled more or less the same way. So these always have to be loaded by the RD&A data management staff, or me. You ultimately, the data will end up coming to me. And we have a data standard, and you can find that on the WFDSS website on the data page. And it really outlines for you the attribution that you need for these data. It outlines for you some considerations in creating these data, what the field names have to be, how long the fields can be, all that good stuff, all the good nerdy GIS stuff. The other thing is that they can only be loaded or changed when we have an update schedule. This used to be quite a challenge, and I think, I don't know, Mark, I feel like we've made some pretty good strides. We've upped our ante in terms of how many offerings and chances we have to get FMU, or strategic objective data, loaded. And now, between January, February, March, April, May, and June, we've got an update every month. And then I think we have two other updates later in the fall/winter. Yep. So hopefully,
July one, and then there's one October and December.
Yeah, so hopefully folks feel like they've got enough chances. Let us know if you don't. We can always work with you and help you out, but we really increase the frequency within which we update those. We'll talk a lot about vertex counts and restrictions within WFDSS on the number of vertices a given layer can have. And what this comes down to, and I guess I'll just talk about it now because we're going to reference it a bit here coming up. When you make a line in GIS, it's made up of a bunch of points. And then, just like your favorite kindergarten book, you connect the dots and you get a nice curve. And so the vertex number can be increased by basically increasing the accuracy of that curve. So if you have 1,000 points per inch, that data, those data are going to be much more complex than something that has 10 points an inch. And so the reason that we care about these seemingly pointless things is that the internet browser that you use, Internet Explorer, Google Chrome, one of those types of things, Firefox, it can only bring so much data through it at a time, right? It's a pipe, basically, and we can only fit so much data in that pipe at one time. And so if we clog that pipe up too much, then it just crashes, or it just doesn't load the data for you. And so the reason we have those limits in vertex numbers is that they're pretty big in terms of pushing them through a browser. So oftentimes we have to set a limit just to prevent the browser from crashing. one of the things that we've really been deliberate about in developing WFDS is that the map should load all the time, regardless of how fast your connection is. We know that's not always possible, but we feel like it does a pretty good job. So that's kind of where these vertex limits come from. If there's too many, we just can't push the data over the internets and into your hands. So with these shapes, because we load them in the back end and we do all of our little magic and mumbo jumbo, there's no limit. So they can be as complex as humanly possible and we'll still get them loaded. And then what happens is once those data are loaded, they're available for you to use to tie strategic objective and or management requirement text to them. So that in a nutshell is your FMUs or your strategic objective shapes. The next category is management requirement shapes. So again, this will come into play for those who are using spatial fire planning. These you can either upload them from a shape file or you can actually draw them on the map within the application. They can be a point, a line, or a polygon. However, WFDS is just going to buffer them if they're a line or a point. And so what happens is if you have a bunch of bald eagle nests that you want to get in and get a management requirement tied to, and you load that shape file as a point layer, WFDS is just going to draw a really small buffer around each of those points and turn it into a polygon. Doesn't really hurt much. We just have to do that because of some technical requirements. So I'd encourage you, if you have line data or you have point data, just go ahead and load it that way. You know, let WFDS buffer them and put them in there. They'll still look like points on your map. They'll more or less behave like points because the buffer's really, really small, and you'll be happy. The other thing that we do with management requirement shapes is that we clip them to your unit boundary whenever you upload them or you draw them. So if you draw a management requirement shape that goes off your forest or off your park or off your refuge or your reservation, we'll just clip it at the end of your unit. And then part of the reason for that is you can't tell your neighbor that he has to cut his grass. And so we can't do fire planning off of our forest or park or whatever. So we just made a decision that we're going to clip them. And so we just do that. We clip them. And so this also prevents us from having to worry about the sort of boundary layer dilemma, which is who's got the right boundary or the best boundary layer. And we just say, okay, within WFDS, we'll just use this one and we can all agree on that. And so we clip it to that. You can also modify them or create new versions of them or delete them at any time. So you load a management requirement for bald eagles. In 2 years' time, you get 100 new bald eagle nests, and you want to do you got to fix the layer in WFDS. You've got more bald eagles. Well, we'll show you a trick at the end here where you can just create a new version. And creating a new version is really cool because all the text that you entered 2 years ago is still in there. It doesn't change, and you just replace the spatial data with a new updated layer, and you can keep moving. So it's pretty cool. Or all the bald eagles flew away and you need to get rid of that shape completely. You can also delete them at any time. So really flexible in terms of the user at the local unit managing that data, modifying, changing, adding new, removing, whatever you want to do, you can more or less do it with management requirement shapes. There is a vertex limit count. So here's that vertex thing again. And with these, there's a 75,000 vertex count limit. So we'll talk about other unit shapes. And for those of you who said, you're the WFDS guru on the poll, you'll know that unit shapes or other unit shapes have a 25,000 vertex limit. So this is 3 times greater than other unit shapes. It still could potentially be small, and we recognize that. But again, we don't want the browser crashing every time you load WFDS. So we have to draw some limits, and we have to make some limitations and some trade-offs. And we'll talk about how you can get around that or work within that. And then, as the last statement says, you tie your management requirement text to these shapes. Pretty simple. They're management requirement shapes. They get associated with management requirement text. And then let's look at other unit shapes, and then I think we'll go to some questions here. But other unit shapes, these are those pretty much referential data. They can be uploaded or drawn. They're not clipped to the unit boundary, and so that can be helpful if you have, a big watershed boundary or something. You can draw it on other people's land because it's sort of less invasive because we don't have text tied to it. You can delete them at any time. You can't really create new versions of these. You can only add them or remove them. And then you manage, they're managed by the local unit, so the local data manager can delete them and they can put new ones in. I mentioned this earlier, there's that 25,000 vertex count limit. And then you can have a point, a line, or a polygon layer with these, which is pretty cool. So for the vertex limit on point layers is 100 points per layer, which seems way small, and I recognize that, but we could probably talk for a long time about why the striking difference between polygons and points, but for now we'll just agree that it's 100 and have to live with that. And then, as I said before, you cannot tie any text to these shapes. They're just in there for reference. And that's other unit shapes. So we'll cover just really quickly before we kind of close the general discussion on shapes. These top 5 things to know about spatial data in WFDS. WFDS only accepts zipped shapefiles. So we don't take geodatabases, we don't take KML or KMZ, we don't take, we take zip shapefiles.
And don't try to zip 2 shapefiles in the same zip. That doesn't work either.
It can work, but you won't like the results often.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen it work where and it happens a lot with fire perimeters, and so that's actually a good cautionary statement. Folks will get the IR data back from the IR flight, and it has the intense heat, the moderate heat, and the scattered heat, as well as the perimeter. And they'll load that full zip shape file or zipped file, and all of a sudden they've got 3 or 4 different polygons for fire perimeters in WFDS. So sometimes WFDS will just handle it.
That's good to know. I didn't know that.
Yeah, but definitely zip shape file, and that will make WFDS very happy. I said this before, but I'll say it again. FMUs and strategic objective shapes are loaded on a schedule. They're not something that can be loaded by the local unit. They are pretty much the first thing that's required to start working in the data management tab. You can't get very far unless you have FMUs or strategic objective shapes loaded. And you can find that schedule on the WFDS website. And
the big thing is make sure you look at the right dates on that.
Yeah, good point. Let's I'll just show it really quick because we're doing pretty decent on time. From the WFDS website here, if you go to the data page, and then you'll see some of these links that I was talking about. Right here's the FMU update schedule. Here is the FMU data standard. And then there's some other things on here, but if you look at the schedule, an important point to point out is that we've got 3 dates. There's a submit data by date, an upload to WFDS date, and then an available in WFDS date. This submit data by date is the one that applies to the field. However, and this is, I'm kind of glossing over it now, but it's an important point to point out, is that most agencies don't just submit their data directly to me. It goes through a GIS lead. You can find that GIS lead from looking at the WFDS GIS team contact list. For the Forest Service, it's Jill Kenzie. For the Park Service, it's Skip Adel. For the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's Cameron Tonje. For the BIA, you can send those directly to me. And for the BLM, it's Diana Sampson. Those individuals may have a different date in mind by which they would like the data. And so it's important to contact them to find out what that date is. So, the next one that's coming up, the next one that's coming up is March 16th, submit data by. Jill Kenzie may have a different date by which she wants that data. So it's important to get in touch with her and find out what that date is. Okay, back to our top 5. Number 3 is that other unit shapes have tight vertex limits, 25,000 vertices. Management requirement shapes have higher limits, 75,000. Okay, so those are the 2 that really sometimes get tricky to work with. If you're above that limit, there's a couple options, and we can chat more about that later. But basically, you have an option to thin the data, and so remove some of those points while still keeping the sort of geometric integrity of the line. So that's an option. The other option is that you could split the layer into multiple individual layers. So one very complex layer may be loaded as 2 layers. That's an option. And then the third option is if it's pretty expansive and you're trying to load a data layer like streams and say every stream on the forest has Rocky Mountain spotted woodpecker habitat, then you may just have to not load a shape. And you may just make that statement in a unit-wide text-based objective that says, every stream on the forest has Rocky Mountain spotted woodpecker habitat. Thank you. Okay, so there's those options. And I think, Mark, that's one that folks kind of have a lot of questions about is, we hit those vertice limits. What do we do? And I think those are really your 3 options. And they're 3 pretty good options. And I hope folks can find some balance in between there.
Yeah, and if you have questions, just let us know. We may learn some new things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the final one is that complex data are often thinned for display in WFDS. And you see this, I see this a fair amount, but I'm always kind of looking for it. And so in a lot of cases, WFDS has 2 versions of every data set. We have the version that we show on the map, and then we have the version behind the scenes that we do processing with. And so because it's so hard to push data through that browser, oftentimes we'll thin out the data. And that might make your polygon look a little funny. And it might make it look not like you loaded it. I've seen really small fire perimeters get loaded that were really, really, really detailed. Somebody walked them with a GPS unit and they're so detailed. And then they get loaded into WFDS and all of a sudden they look like a blob. And so that is purely for display. But we've always got that original unthinned version of that shape on the back end that we're using for things like analyses, fire behavior modeling, values inventory creation, all that kind of stuff. So if you see something like that happening, don't worry too much about it and know that it's more just for display. I think, Mark, I know that always seems to kind of throw folks for a loop when you load up your really nice looking data and it doesn't, all of a sudden it looks like a pizza.
Yeah, we've been talking about that in Denver while I'm at the workshop here explaining that, so yeah, that has come up.
Yeah, and that's purely for display, so don't get too alarmed. Okay, Mark, I thought we could pause here, take a few questions. Did you getting some questions in the question box?
I've been getting a few in here, but I think I've been answering pretty much most of the ones that I've gotten, unless there's some that are out on the phone.
If anyone has a question, there's a raise your hand button, and go ahead and raise your hand, and we can grab your question. No questions? I guess I should probably look at the attendees, and I could see if anybody raises.
Yeah, I've been answering quite a few of them. So.
A couple of hands. A couple hands raised here. Ooh, a lot of hands raised. Let's start. Brian Jarner. I'm going to unmute you, Brian. If you go ahead and did you have a question?
No, I didn't.
Okay, your hand was raised. Thanks. Mute Brian. Somebody else. David Collins, your hand's raised. Did you have a question?
No, nothing.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, 2 out of 3. Oh, wait. Gus Smith, do you have a question? You have your question box. I didn't see that one.
Yeah, I typed in a question there.
Oh, cool.
I just sent you an answer. I got a couple in here, Ben, real quick. This is one that comes up quite a bit. Does WFDSS work better with Internet Explorer or Google Chrome? And I know you know the answer to that one.
Yeah, so WFDSS was built using Internet Explorer as the agency-approved browser, and so WFDSS will work best with Internet Explorer. It works really well with Chrome, and it even works pretty good with Safari on a Mac. But since the official agency browser is Internet Explorer, that's what we test it primarily on. But we're always working on compatibility because we recognize that folks use other browsers. So definitely IE.
And then one of the other questions that came up had to do with the definitions and the way that they're named. They're asking if those will be changed over time. That's possible. Strategic objectives and management requirements, the definitions, the names, we ran those through the Interagency Fire Planning Committee just to kind of get a standard. So that's what they are for now. They could change, but right now that's where they're at. What we have done is suggested as part of this that the agencies do some crosswalks if they need to. I know the BLM has done one as far as what those terms mean to them. So, but for right now, the names, again, and I understand the confusion sometimes we start talking objectives and requirements. Basically, think of these as one, the strategic objective is that layer that doesn't, it doesn't go over itself. I can't remember whether it was the BLM had a really good way of explaining that, where management requirements can cross over each other.
Yeah.
So just within WFDSS, we've got the definitions in the WFDSS guide that I built in there for spatial fire planning. I would suggest to go look at those and read through them, and that'll help you with when you're explaining to line officers. So, but it goes a little, it's a little better to just kind of say, don't focus on exactly what that says as far as how it's written, but look at what the definition says, and that'll help.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. We get that question a lot, and we'll start to get into a lot of that here in the next section on the webinar when we're talking about the fire planning process.
Yeah, and one other quick question, Ben, is there a way to share the questions that have been asked and the answers, and as far as the ones that we've been typing in?
Yeah, I will. We'll be posting a recording of this webinar, so that's one way. And then the other way, I can do that. I can I'll get a transcript of all the questions that we got in. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we'll make sure you get an answer afterwards. And then we can also post those Q&A, that Q&A portion of this when we post the video as well. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yep.
Okay, that's all the questions I got so far, and everything else has been answered.
Okay. Well, let's go onward. Just a quick reminder, this webinar is scheduled to go until 14:30 or 2:30 Mountain Time, so halfway there, folks. And I apologize for the length. We tried doing this last year in an hour, and there's just so much content to cover that we felt it was just better to bite the bullet and make it an hour and a half. So let's talk about planning processes, Mark. My favorite Shark Tank topic.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so starting at the top, we've got this concept of planning processes in WFDSS, and I found this graphic in it, well, this image, and it conveniently fit exactly what I was looking to show. But this is kind of my interpretation of it, or my breakdown of it. You've got on the left the FMU process, on the right the spatial fire planning process. The FMU process gives you one layer, and in that one layer you have to fit management requirements and strategic objectives. And on top of that, none of the polygons can overlap. So that worked, and it worked for a few years. And then what happened was we started noticing that there was a ton of duplication. And so having to fit management requirements and strategic objectives in one layer and not allowing any of the shapes to overlap, it was near impossible with some of the more complex plans on some of the larger units to pull that off. And so about that same time, there was an effort underway, mostly in the Department of Interior bureaus, to do something called spatial fire planning. And that was really taking the existing plan and spatially representing it, or making really nice maps that showed where things were, and did a much nicer and cleaner job of representing the plan. And so we kind of grabbed onto the name, and we grabbed onto pretty much more or less the effort that was happening, and that was very clearly to say, let's build a polygon layer or a set of polygons that represent your response to fire. Here I'm always going to suppress. Here I'm sometimes going to suppress. Here I'm never going to suppress. So using those polygons as really the overarching strategy, and then once you had your strategy laid out, everything else basically became a value or a consideration, a constraint, or something to consider while you were carrying out that strategy. So our interpretation became, you get two layers when you use the spatial fire planning process. One layer is your strategic objectives. That still can't overlap, because the idea being I can't say always suppress and never suppress at the same time. So if the strategic objective layer overlapped, we would have the risk of that happening. So he said no overlap on the strategic objective layer. And then we give you another container or another group of layers, and that's your management requirement layers. We had to work within the framework that we had already in WFDSS, and so this is where some of that terminology debate comes into play. But they're management requirement shapes. And management requirement shapes can overlap. They can overlap themselves, they can overlap each other, they can overlap the strategic objective shapes. It doesn't matter. Okay, they loosely represent all the stuff you care about out there on your landscape. So those are kind of, very generally speaking, the two planning processes, sort of applying a spatial lens to it in a way. Ultimately, no matter which planning process you use, the end result is still the same, right? Your strategic objectives and your management requirements end up in the objectives tab within your decision, and then ultimately they make their way into that approved WFDSS decision. So basically, either planning process, the result's the same. It's just two different ways to get there in the middle, more or less. So what are the differences? So in a lot of ways, it's kind of apples and oranges, Mark. I think the age old comparison here. FMUs, and this is a lot of what I just talked about, but just giving folks a really good slide to take a screen capture of. But the FMU planning process, one layer, polygons can't overlap. Your objectives and your requirements have to use that same layer. And the icing on the cake, you can't manage the data loading at all. They come to me and I load them. And in this regard, Ben's the data manager. From there, after the spatial data are loaded, you still get to handle entering all the text, but somewhat restrictive. But I will say, also still a very good fit for a lot of units. I think this is, to me, Mark, I don't know, sometimes I hear, well, you start in FMU and you work towards spatial fire planning. They're both spatial, right? At the end of the day, we're still using shapes and geography to describe our management plan. So to me, this is where the terminology thing comes in. Both of these processes are spatial. And in my opinion, you could use the FMU planning process in WFDSS to represent a spatial fire management plan. No problem. In fact, a lot of BIA units that are very simple, cut and dry, very limited opportunities to use fire for resource objectives, the FMU process works glamorous. The other side of that coin is the more open spatial fire planning process. With spatial fire planning process, you get two data layers, and then they fall into two categories. The first one's those strategic objective shapes. They're not allowed to overlap. They need to be submitted to Ben, and they're tied to your strategic objectives. And then the management requirements, like we talked about, they can overlap themselves and or the strategic objective shapes, and they're managed by you, the user, and they can be updated, deleted, reversioned at any time. So you've got a lot more say in the management of your data. Is that pretty clear, Mark?
Yep, and I don't know if I didn't hear if you mentioned this. The other thing with the FMU process is you could have created a decision with tabular data and not had the spatial, at least at the beginning of it, I know. So that was one of the other differences.
True.
You have to have that spatial data for spatial fire planning.
Yep. Yeah. Right on. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. If you use FMU, you don't have to load any spatial data. So you can make it non-spatial. There's a little bit of manual work you got to do, but you can stay on FMU and not make it spatial. I'm going to skip.
Otherwise, I think you hit everything.
Good. Okay, in the interest of time and moving to getting into the application, this is my sort of river trip down the process behind moving from FMU to SFP. And so a question we always get, Mark, is how do I do it? What's the sequence of events? What should I be doing when? When do I push the button? All these kinds of questions are always coming. And so we put this together last year. We checked it last week, and I checked it again today. To me, this is still as good a way as any. I won't say that there is a only way to do it. There's a lot of ways to go about this, but this is a consistent path for folks to follow if they are so inclined. And so the first step would be, we have a little Excel button in WFDSS, and it's really handy because it allows you to download all of your strategic objectives and management requirements into Excel spreadsheet. So I always say start there, because when we move to spatial fire planning, some things are going to happen in the application. Some stuff's going to get deactivated, and you're going to be deleting stuff, and it's good just to have that backup of where it all started. So go ahead and click that button, download all your stuff, and then you've got a copy of it. So after you've done that, then you really start outside of WFDSS preparing your spatial data. And with a good understanding of what all these are now, and hopefully enough resources out there to dive even deeper, you should start really thinking about, what are my strategic objective polygons? What are those broad strategy statements, and what are the polygons that represent those statements? And then once you kind of have that, then you start rounding up your requirements and constraints and considerations and values and bird nests and fish habitat and all those data as management requirement shapes. And then take a look if there's something that doesn't fit within strategic objective or management requirement shapes. Do you need it? Should be your first question. And your second question should be, if you answered yes, then would it make a good other unit shape? Or do I really need text tied to that? Does text need to come into every decision that intersects it? And if the answer is yes, then try to fit it into management requirement shapes. I think the important thing to think about when you're compiling these data is not let yourself get too limited by that requirement word. And use management requirements and use them well, and use them in such a way that benefits you representing your plan as accurately as possible. So once you've got that data together, then you submit the strategic objective polygons to your agency GIS lead, or potentially that's just directly to me. But you submit those data for loading in WFDSS, paying close attention to those dates that we showed earlier. And then you wait. At this point, you could go in and start tinkering under the hood, but my recommendation is just go ahead and wait till those strategic objectives are loaded. Now with the monthly uploads for the next few months yet, it won't be that long until the data are in there and you can get cooking. So try to plan your schedule accordingly so that when the data become available, you've got time to crank. So while you're waiting, you can start cleaning up that spreadsheet. You can start thinking about, okay, I've got these 5 strategic objective polygon categories. What are the strategic objective statements that are going to be tied to them? And then you can look at, I've got all of these values data. What statement do I want tied to them? And I've got my resource objectives. Do I want to put those in with this? I've got my MPCs and my MAs and all these different things. Start figuring out how that fits in while you're waiting for that data to be loaded. And then when the data are loaded, flip the switch. Change over from FMU to spatial fire planning. And some things will happen, and we'll talk about that. But so by that time, when you flip the switch, hopefully, if you follow this scheme, everything will be ready. And it's just a copy paste exercise. You copy out of your Excel document into Word, and you tie your polygons to your text, and you're good. Then you load up your management requirement shapes, and you do the same. You copy and paste out of your Excel. Okay. What I miss, Mark? Anything?
Not that I can think of right at the moment.
Okay. So what happens when I hit the button? The dreaded switch button. I'd encourage folks to go ahead and do it. What's nice is that if you click the spatial fire planning radio button in WFDSS, we're not just gonna, it doesn't just automatically poof, now you're on spatial fire planning. We give you this big obnoxious warning. And folks can read this at your leisure. We're gonna actually do that today. We're gonna click the button and we can see what actually happens. And we'll go through this line by line in a live exercise. But we make it sound, I'll admit, Mark, we put this big warning message in there, and I think in some ways we scare folks more than we need to, but I think it's a pretty big thing to push the button because the system deactivates and disables and does a few things for you. So we want to make sure people really, really, really want to do it before they just go do it.
Correct.
So let's step into WFDSS. Do we want to pause do we have questions coming in? Should we catch some of those, or?
Yeah, we have a few. I can give you a couple here. So one of them is, what's the best way to handle very large complex layers or WUI layers? And then can they send stuff to you if they need help?
Okay, so, excuse me, I've been fighting this cold for a week. The best way to handle, in my opinion, the best way to handle really large, complex data is to first start by asking yourself the question, do I need this to support a strategic decision? And by that, I mean to look at it not from this is really good tactical data, but look at, like a roads layer as an example. Do you need that to inform a strategy? Probably not. We've got a pretty good roads layer in WFDSS right now. That should more or less suffice for what you need WFDSS for. So that really, to me, is to be very critical of each data set that you try to load, because in some senses, if the data are extremely complex, there's probably a pretty decent chance that there's either a better way to put it into WFDSS, or B, a very good reason that it maybe shouldn't be in there. If the answer to the question is, yeah, it really truly does help me support a strategic decision, and it just needs to be in there, then the first step I would take would be to thin that, shape, or to thin that shape file. And you can do that using like the generalized tool in ArcGIS. And if folks, I can try to find some information on it, and maybe post a link in the notes of this webinar, but try to thin that shape. And then if thinning the shape doesn't work, in other words, sometimes you thin a shape too much and what was a square becomes a circle, and it just doesn't look pretty and it doesn't work anyway. then your only option really is to split it into multiples. So those are probably my recommendations. But to start at that very first question and be very, you know, like I said, be very critical of whether or not it needs to be in there, is the best starting point I can say. Others?
Let's see. So one at Scott says, but if we have several SOs for the unit, how do we tie them to a polygon? And, you know, that's one thing we can talk a little bit about too is I'm dealing with Forest in Region 2 right now. It's okay to have more than one strategic objective. They just can't overlap.
Yeah.
So, and I've seen some where you may have a range of options. So a forest may have 3 strategic objectives. In some places they apply individually, but you may have a place where 2 of those apply. So you're going to have now a forest, but it's going to contain both those directions.
Yep.
If that makes sense. But they don't overlap.
Yeah.
In that
respect. You might have to have a cookie cutter donut hole out of one of them.
So I've got some that say you could do direct control or prescription control in the same polygon. It's just depending on a few options that are going on there. And sometimes it'll split it down by a management area or a geographic area, you know, make it a little more finite. So,
yep.
And if you have questions, you know, after this, just let me know.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and I didn't intentionally dodge the second part of that question earlier, but are we available for help? The answer is yeah. You know, I think that's, both Mark and myself are always available for questions about converting to spatial fire planning, about how to use WFDSS, about, you know, what's the best way to, you know, I get those phone calls a lot. Here's a plan that I can't wrap my head around it. How can we get this into WFDSS? What's the best, easiest, simplest way with the least duplication to put this into the application? So yeah, we're definitely available for help with that stuff for sure.
I think we're pretty well caught up there, and I've got a couple I'll work on as we go, and then let you get going again.
Copy. Thank you. Okay, so let's go into WFDSS. I think it logged me out. Close down some of these. Okay, I'm probably gonna, I'm just gonna log out and log back in. Okay, so what I thought I would do is, we've got a mythical national forest in WFDSS that's little known to most people, but the Land of Oz National Forest is in Kansas, of all places. And so this is our little test forest that I've been playing with. And so I've got, just as an example, well, I guess starting from the top, for those that aren't too familiar with the data management tab here, at the top, this is where you choose which unit you want to work with. So you choose your GA, your agency, and then your unit. Next to that is where you would make the switch from FMU to spatial. By default, everything starts on FMU. You have to make the choice to move to spatial. And then, so collapsing that, the next section down is this filter option. And one of the early on most annoying features about the data management tab was that in WFDSS, you can't delete something after it's been activated. And so the idea being that if something was activated, it could either be already used in a decision or have had the potential to be used in a decision. And so to maintain the integrity of the system, i.e. you go look at an old decision, we need to have that data still hanging around. So you can only deactivate it, and so stuff would clog up. And so here's just an example. If I turn my filter off, I've got all this flying monkey evacuation plan and all this other stuff. I've got 3 pages of this crud that's all been deactivated. So to clean things up, you can just turn on the currently active filter and hit apply, and now we just see what's active and what applies now. So you can also look just by an FMU, whatever you need. So here's the stuff that I have activated right now for my Land of Oz, and let's move over to the FMU/SO codes tab. And so here are the 4 FMUs that I currently have on the FMU planning process. I've got Central, Northeast, Southeast, and Western. And then I've got descriptions for each of those. Well, I would like to switch to spatial fire planning. And so in doing so, I need to figure out what's going to happen to my data. And so we can take a look here. If I click this radio button, and it says we are confirming the change on KSOZF, Land of Oz National Forest, to spatial fire planning. And the first thing that it says is that my FMU level management requirements will immediately be disabled, and they can never ever be re-enabled. They can be recreated but not re-enabled. And so we just talked about that, and it sounds really kind of frightening, but the text will still be there when this is all said and done. It'll just have a deactivated date in the deactivated column down here. So that's not as big and scary as it sounds. The reason for that is you're going to load new management requirements anyway, right? If you're switching to spatial fire planning, now you're going to get to use those super awesome management requirement shapes. And so you don't care. You want to load new ones anyway. So that'll happen. Those will be deactivated. All existing FMU shapes will be considered strategic objective shapes. So the data that are currently loaded in the system for your FMUs will become your strategic objective shapes. This statement, this exact statement, is why in our little river trip down the move to spatial fire planning, that's why I recommend waiting until your new data are loaded. Because once those new data are loaded, that's what you want to happen. You created those to be strategic objective polygons. So go ahead and let it happen, and that's exactly what you want to happen. And then what happens is that all of your existing FMU codes will become strategic objective codes. So in other words, if your code doesn't change, so let me cancel out of this and show you what I mean. When I switched to spatial fire planning, I loaded my new layer to have these same codes. So I wanted to just stay with the same codes because I like the text that's tied to them. So basically that'll happen. Anything that has a code that ties to the polygon will stay active. And then all strategic objective codes associated with existing shapes will be activated, while all other codes will be deactivated. Active strategic objectives associated with deactivated. This is a really big confusing statement. What this means to say is that if the text and the code it represents isn't tied to some polygon, it'll just be deactivated. So I happen to have a code here, Western. There's no polygon in my spatial fire planning or my strategic objective shapes. There's no polygon to represent Western. So what's going to happen when I move to spatial fire planning, this goes away. And so anything that's tied to western goes away as well. So pretty easy, basically. On spatial fire planning, everything has to be tied to a polygon. And then unit-wide strategic objectives and management requirements will be unaffected, and you'll be able to draw and upload management requirement shapes. So let's just go ahead and hit the button. We're going to say confirm change. And all of a sudden, just like that, we're on spatial fire planning. And so let's go to currently active and take a peek at what happened. I happened to, earlier today, grab a before shot. So this might get it slightly confusing. But before the switch, this window here, well, let me make that easier to see. Before the switch, I had these in red, and there were a good number of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 different statements. After the switch, I end up with 3. And so what happened was anything that was a management requirement got deactivated. So all these management requirements here, here's just an example. This one, my constraints for MPC 2.2, is now deactivated. I can still find it, but it got deactivated. And my little western, it's no longer tied to a spatial polygon. And so it also got deactivated. And so now what I have, if I go over to my unit map, I have 3 strategic objective polygons. I've got central, northeast, and southeast. And so fairly straightforward. And now I've also got the option to include management requirement shapes. And then I still have other unit shapes. I had these before the switch, and I still have this now. So that honestly is fairly straightforward. We make it sound, as I said, I think pretty scary, but really, again, everything's still there. We can see if I look for my western one and I apply the filter, it's still there. And if I wanted to get it back, I could just copy this text and paste it in a new one. So if I say create strategic objective, I could paste it right in there, and I could make it tied to something else or make it unit wide. Okay, so fairly straightforward. Let's go back and take a look at the unit shapes tab. So management requirement shapes are the first in the list under the unit selection panel. And so to upload a management requirement shape is fairly easy. I choose the file, and I've got, let's look at buffalo grazing. And I'm going to call this, my label is buffalo, and we'll call it buffalo grazing area. And then I just say upload. The data set was queued for upload, and I'll just step away from that tab and step back, and now I've got my buffalo grazing area. And so I currently don't have any text associated with buffalo grazing. And so what I can do is I can go view update. Let me slow down. I can go to this button, View/Update Associations. If I click that button, it says, you don't have any active management requirements, so you need to create one. So I click Create Management Requirement, and I'll say keep fire out of, well, let's call this be careful, those things are huge. And we'll save it. And now if I click this box right here under the Associate tab, and I activate it, now I've got be careful, those things are huge, tied to my Buffalo management requirement shape.
Hey, Ben?
Yep.
One of the questions that's come up since I've been here and on the some of the questions I've been trying to answer is about if we have a seasonal management requirement, how that works when we take it in and out. Does it disappear, or or is it recorded if it's part of a decision? How does that work? So say it's buffalo grazing over a certain period of time, and so they may not want to keep it in there the whole time because it'll come up in their decisions even though it's not valid because it's seasonal. Can you remove and add back and forth?
Yeah, temporal, you could definitely do that. And I would just come in here and on the day that you no longer want it, and you could just say deactivate it. And by deactivating it, it disappears and it'll no longer show up in my in my decisions. That text won't come in. If I come back over to the Objectives tab here and I say Management Requirement, I say Management Requirement, it also deactivated the text. And so all of a sudden that's gone. So the text is gone, the shape's gone when I deactivate it. And then in the in the spring, I could just come back in here and reload it. And choose my shapefile again, choose buffalo grazing, and then I'll go through that process again. So that's the beauty of management requirement shapes in a lot of ways, is that you control it completely. So if you have something that's temporal or time sensitive, then you have the ability to make that change whenever you want. And so that would be my recommendation on how to handle it. You can either, well, let me just get through this screen once. So you can either deactivate, you can either deactivate it or associate. And so you could deactivate it. You could just delete it, but you're only going to be able to delete it if it's not activated. So you actually won't be able to. You won't be able to do that. But I would just deactivate it. Yep, is what I'd do. Does that answer that, Mark?
Yep, that's what I was wondering about. And then just another question that's come up is if it's tied to a decision, will it just be, is it still able to be deleted out of here and it just stays part of that decision record, but you don't have that, doesn't keep it in there, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not that the shape disappears and the shape's more or less gone, right? But that text is still there.
Yeah, you'd have the information still in the decision you made 3 weeks ago, but when you delete it now, it's gone in here, but it's still part of that decision. You just have to reference it.
Yep. See, right here it is. Here's that original. Be careful. These things are huge. Because remember, in your decision, we don't put a map in the decision, right? To to get a picture of the data or a map of the data, you would have to use either a screen capture or the map capture button from the situation map to get that to go into your decision as a graphic. And so really, all of the shape data that you see here, all of these strategic objective shapes, all my management requirement shapes, my other unit shapes, other unit shapes excluded, I guess. The strategic objective shapes, the management requirement shapes are purely used for us to bring text into your decision. Okay? It's how WFDSS brings text into that decision. If I draw a polygon like this for a planning area, WFDSS then knows to look at the blue box, see what text is associated with it, and bring it into your decision. Look at the green box, see what text is associated with it, bring it into the decision. We don't bring the picture of the box in unless you take a static picture of that data and bring it into the decision, in which case that image is never going away in your decision, nor is the text. So yeah.
One other quick one, and I knew you kind of hit on it earlier, is with some of the different shapes, people have asked if they can have something that goes outside of the admin boundaries, such as a protection zone, just for information. And can correct me if I'm wrong, but the strategic objectives form that shape that would be what your area is in, and then anything as far as a management requirement would be clipped by the strategic objective shape. But are unit shapes clipped by that as well, or they go outside?
Other unit shapes can extend beyond your unit boundary. So here's an example of my watershed boundary polygon that goes outside the boundary. Some of the challenge with other unit shapes, here I'll just draw a quick one to kind of represent. So let's say this is your protection boundary in yellow. When I load that in as a other unit shape, what's going to happen is it's the same color as the other one. So it can get hard to differentiate your other unit shapes. You have to kind of turn them on and off. But so there's an example of what you're kind of talking about. A protection boundary that goes beyond the forest boundary, loaded as a other unit shape. There's no text tied to it at all, purely for reference. And it's
one other thing, and I don't know if you talked about it, but the adding to values table button on
yeah, I was gonna get that. So let's step back here into the unit shapes tab, and just a couple of quick notes on management requirement shapes before I kind of close on that one. But there's a button here that says replace shape. This is how you can version management requirement shapes. So in other words, let's say my buffalo pasture grows, and all of a sudden we put up 100 new miles of fence this year, and I need to better represent that in WFDSS. You just come in, choose replace shape, you click OK, you can grab a new shape, and maybe it's now, I don't know, we'll basically load the same thing, but you can say replace. You also, at that time, have the option of changing the label and the description. The text that I have associated with it, the management requirement text that I have associated with it, will stay tied to it, even though I changed the geometry or the shapefile and the label. So you can quote unquote version them and keep all the associated text the same. So if right now it's associated with this is cool. Okay, so if I come back out here and I say replace shape, And I say, okay, and we'll just choose butterfly. And I'll call this buffalo pasture. And we'll just make that buffalo. And I say replace. If I come in here, I change the label, I change the description. Oh, I was wrong. So let me recant my statement. You can replace the shape, but you can't replace the label. Once you replace the label, then you break the connection. So,
Ben, if we have some reasoning why we do this, is there any place in WFDSS to document why we did something?
yeah, so let me just clear that up. So once you change the label, you break the shape association with the text. So don't change the label, but you can change the shape that's tied to it without harm. If you're doing something like that and you just wanted to make a note about it, there's a couple of options that we have. Number one is that you can actually use you can use this note section, which allows you to just quickly put a note in here. Add note. I updated the.
And one thing while he's writing that in there, you have the option to associate that to strategic objectives or management requirements, so you can kind of get those categorized a little bit as the notes, so it's easier to find things.
Yep. So I'm gonna say that's a shape, and then I'll say I updated the buffalo pasture shape today. The requirement text stayed the same. Okay, cool. So you can make those kinds of notes. The other thing that you can do is from the Objectives tab, there's this Show History button. And this is sort of the all-powerful, the all-encompassing history, behind-the-scenes stuff that happened, who clicked what button when, and so we can see all the stuff that happened earlier today. A management requirement shape was created, unit process. So this is, when did we switch to spatial fire planning? Oh, that was at 15:13 Central Time on the 25th of February. So you can kind of come in and see all that stuff. And I think it's pretty neat. We try to expose that within WFDSS whenever we can. So that's versioning. The other thing that I wanted to briefly hit on, let me double check where's my slideshow? The other thing that I wanted to briefly hit on, here's this thing on versioning. The export planning process button. And what this allows you to do, let's just look at the text here. You can export your planning data from WFDSS production to training. So it doesn't work that you try it out, get it just right in training, and then go to production, unfortunately. We only let you go from production to training. So once you get all this stuff figured out, once you get production perfect, the idea being that within a couple of button clicks, you can make training look exactly like production. So you can train using the exact same setup that you have in production. This will bring and move and duplicate all of your management requirements and the shapes, the strategic objectives, the other unit shapes, and it'll make training exactly like production. One caveat is there's a little bit of cleanup that you have to do to deactivate some of the old shapes, but more or less it works like a charm. The way it works is pretty simple. if I sign out of training and sign into production, I go to data management, I'm going to go to Rocky Mountain, I'm going to go to Land of Oz. Oh, I don't have Land of Oz in production, so I can't try that. Anyway, you choose your unit, you hit export planning process, and then you give it a description. Nothing comes out of WFDS. It all stays within WFDS. So the term export is sort of misused here, but you can give it a description. You know, maybe it's today's date. I think we date stamped it, but you can give it today's date. You hit export, and then you sign out. You go to training, you sign in, you go to the same unit, and you hit import. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to screw up somebody else's unit, but when you hit import, you will see one of the exports here. And so you can actually choose that export and bring it in. So it's pretty, when you have to do it, it's pretty simple and self-explanatory. And we've actually got really good online help for it. So you can check that out. But I more or less wanted to let folks know that it was there. Mark, we're 4 minutes over. A couple quick things, and then if you have some questions and folks want to stay on, I'd be happy to stay and answer questions. But we've got some additional resources. We've got, Mark made mention of it earlier, the Spatial Fire Planning Guide. Mark brushed that thing up, and it's looking pretty darn good, if I do say so myself. That's an excellent resource. We tried to thin that out a little bit, and hopefully it's to everyone's liking, but that's a good guide just to have at your side when you're working through this stuff. And you can find that on the WFDS training page. The online help's also just an awesome resource. I can't say it enough. Marlena and Diane on our team, and a number of others, Morgan and Kathy and several other people, they just spend so much time making sure that when something changes in WFDS, it's updated and reflected in the help. And so you could spend days literally just kind of following rabbit trails in the online help. One really useful thing is that the help is sort of context sensitive. In other words, it knows where you are in the application. And so as an example, if I do this import-export planning process and then I hit help, it just takes me right there. You know, this is how, you don't get much better than that. Exporting, importing, or deleting your planning process, and you can follow the steps and away you go. Really super helpful. So check that out. The WFDS website, the training page in particular, the WFDS 101 series is really cool. We've got YouTube videos that accompany all the PDFs and the PowerPoints, and that's just really killer stuff. The Wildland Fire Management RD&A staff, we've got somebody on call 24/7, 365. Give us a call through that line. Mark is doing an awesome job getting with folks, figuring out how to get these complex plans into WFDS. Reach out to Mark, reach out to me. This webinar will make this recording available. I said the same words last year at about this same time, and it just didn't work because GoToMeeting did not record either of my sessions. If it doesn't this time, I'm done with GoToWebinar, but I'm hoping it will. And as I mentioned earlier, we're doing a lot of really cool stuff with 508 compliance and transcripts and making sure stuff is accessible for folks who need it to be. So that's pretty exciting. And then also, I'd encourage you to be a snoop. there is some really cool, good stuff going on in the WFDS data management tab anymore. There's some units that are doing some creative things. They are figuring out how best to use the system. And so I'd encourage you to take a look around. That's some of the beauty of having the data management role, is you can take a look at other people's stuff. Be careful that you don't move somebody over to spatial fire planning, but take a peek, reach out to those people. If the person's in WFDS, you can find them in the My Home address book, and you can search by unit name and all that good stuff. So find people who are doing this and doing it well, and hire it from them. That was all I had, and I know it's a lot, so if there's questions, Mark, I've got time. We can answer a few more, I think. I encourage folks to stay. I can't make you stay. I know it's been a long webinar, and I really do appreciate you staying. That's all the planned content we had for today, and we'll just take a few questions here and get the transcript.
One of the questions that came up was why it only goes from production to training when you're downloading the planning process. And I believe the reason was that when they first originally did this, they were afraid that someone could accidentally export the process from training to production, and then if you're in the middle of fires, you could have some issues. So that's why they have it just only going from production to training. But we have been looking at that as an option to go the other way, realizing that people would rather do some messing around in training and then have it fixed there and go the other way. But that's kind of why the original reason. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but I thought that's what it had to do with.
No, yeah, that's exactly what I remember, and it's just, boy, it just would not be a good thing to screw up, an entire forest's production system of WFDS in the peak of fire season. So, yeah, that button's pretty powerful. We made it sound fairly easy and benign, but it's pretty powerful. It can do a lot of damage. So, definitely trying to limit that, the damage that it does.
Okay. And then I've got, I got one question in here about an upload in December, and I will defer and have them go ahead and contact you directly on that. Scott Tolber had something that doesn't seem to have loaded. So Todd, I would suggest that you go ahead and just email Ben directly, and he can look into that and then get back to you.
Yeah.
And then the next one is, when a unit loads their SO shapes, does it load to both training and production?
Can you repeat that?
If a unit loads their SO shapes, does it load to both training and production?
Affirmative, yes. We share the same data set between the two systems, and so we don't offer the option to only load this in training. It's both or nothing. Unfortunately, that's something we've had forever. We've never offered the option to load different in each system. It just, yeah. So I'd encourage, there are some creative ways now to test drive stuff before you, before you really load a new strategic objective layer. The other thing I'd say is that, we've got 1 month turnaround now on strategic objective updates for a couple more months. If you're not anywhere near fire season yet, you may be all right to, let production ride for a month with no fires in sight.
Yeah, and one other question that kind of came up is, if people are in mid-season with fire, should they try and change things? And, I guess that's ultimately up to you, but I guess one of the things to consider is, if right now what you have is not contradictory to any kind of land management planning, but it could be better. Then maybe kind of getting through your fire season rather than trying to change that all up may be a better way to go, and then fix it after. It's kind of like a team transition on a fire. You start changing things, it can mess people up, but that's ultimately up to you as far as changing. If you're already in fire season, you're considering trying to change. I mean, do you have the time and whatnot to do that?
Yeah, I agree. If what you have, if what you have meets your current FMP or whatever your planning document is, and you're moving over because of an agency requirement, but both versions will basically satisfy that plan, I'd
Right.
stay with the existing.
Yeah.
Unless you're out of compliance with your plan, there's no reason to try to do that in the middle of.
Yep, that's kind of my thing. But like I say, it's ultimately up to them, but that's kind of our suggestion.
Yeah.
One other one is, could you have the same FMU-SO layer in production and training, but have production in FMU planning and training in spatial fire planning to test things out? When you
Yes.
switch to spatial planning, does it switch in both production and training?
That is independent, and so you can be on spatial in training and not in production. Yep. That is.
And one of the things that a suggestion I have, if your FMU shapes does not match what you're planning on putting in training, one workaround would be to create, if you're in training, to just create some management requirements and just call them SO shapes.
Yep.
And then you could put those in and see what they look like and play with the language. That's one option, because some people may be in the process of changing the shape file, so they're going to have more or less, and so that would be one way to do that while you're still using that old FMU shape.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say, Mark, is flip the button in training. Don't worry about what happens at all. Let everything fall where it will fall, and the wrath of switching happen, and then just jump right into unit shapes and start loading your strategic objectives in here. See what call it SO 1-2, and then this is my shape, and then load that shape, and then you can get them all loaded up. You can load all your strategic objective shapes that way, load all your management requirement shapes that way, and then go in and create a test fire and ignore all the strategic objective stuff that comes in and only pay attention to the management requirement stuff that comes in. That'll show you exactly what it will look like when you do it right.
So that's all the questions I have right now. And just to put a plug in also, Ben's been doing a pretty good job with this, and if you have questions, he definitely has answers. So thank you, Ben, for putting this on. I think a lot of people really got a lot out of it from what I've seen in the past, and then just people that I've talked to. So I think this has been good. And if you have any recommendations for us, please email us on things that might actually help later on. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Hit the feedback button, and I think we're always open to ideas and listening to users, because we're trying to support the system. There's certain things we can do and can't do, and this year's going to be a little lean in terms of changes that we can make, just given contract stuff. But as Mark said, there's usually some pretty creative ways that we can get stuff in there. So give us a call if you've got something pretty challenging, and it might talk your ear off, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah, and one other thing is, as far as the closed captioning, to make sure folks, if they want that, you're going to have to download that transcript to get those. You can save it as a text file or an HTML file.
Yeah, we're going to try to match it up with the recording and do some stuff, but I hope to, at a minimum, have the captionless version of this webinar posted very soon, potentially as early as tomorrow. So And one final thing before we close, I did put together a real short survey that'll be emailed to you after this. Please do let us know. Let me know how this went, what we missed. I always wish we had more time to just get into WFDS and do things. And I wish we could turn folks' volume on to where you could talk. It's just with 100 people, it's really hard. So,
one real quick thing, Ben, not to interrupt you too much, but just curiosity, could people hit their hand buttons if anybody did use the closed captions or viewed them? Just trying to see if anybody saw them, and let us know if you did use that, if it seemed to work, or what were some of the pitfalls so we can remedy that as well. See if any hands go up here. Looks like we had one maybe, James Savage,
cool.
David Collins, Brian Jarner. So we got a few people in there. So yeah, just send us some comments if you got anything how it worked. That'd be great. This is the first time we've used it, so.
I commend the person that did it. It's impressive. I could not keep up with me, so that's really good.
Yeah,
Okay.
Diane Rao really helped a lot of this too, so thank you, Diane.
Yes, if you're interested in more fun, we'll be doing this again next week. Same day of the week, but earlier in the morning. So maybe we'll see some of you there. And that's all I have. I need a drink.
Yep.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and close this thing down, and we'll talk to you all soon.